Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive, crafted specifically for you. We're really thrilled to have you with us today because we are looking at a piece of history that reads exactly like a Hollywood script.
But it's entirely true.
Right, 100% true. Today's mission is to explore the history, the heroism, and the truly fascinating public relations campaign behind a legendary World War I aviation unit, the Lafayette Escadrille.
And to do this, we're pulling from a comprehensive historical text that details the origins, the combat records, the casualties, and of course the lasting legacy of this pioneering fighter squadron.
Exactly. And, we really need to establish the stakes here right from the jump.
Yeah, because the context of the era, it changes everything. I mean, before World War I, aircraft weren't even considered combat units. They were novelties.
Basically just motorized kites.
Yeah, barely more than that. So what we are going to explore today is how a group of American volunteers not only fundamentally changed the concept of aerial warfare, but also actively tried to shift global politics in the process.
They were fighting in the skies, but...
They were simultaneously fighting for headlines back home.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Because the origin story of this unit is completely wild. It didn't start with a military general drawing up battle plans in some war room. It started with essentially two civilians.
Two very connected civilians, yeah.
You have Dr. Edmund L. Gross, who was a founder of the American Hospital of Paris, and he was an organizer of the American Ambulance Field Service. And alongside him, you have Norman Prince.
A Harvard-educated lawyer.
Exactly. An American expatriate who happened to already be flying for France. These two men spearheaded the attempt to persuade the French government that a volunteer American air unit fighting for France would be highly valuable.
And their core motivation was incredibly calculated. I mean, it wasn't simply about getting Americans into the fight to shoot down enemy planes.
It was a PR stunt.
A deliberate, high-stakes publicity stunt. Gross and Prince wanted the French government to formally recognize an all-American volunteer unit specifically to grab the attention of the American public. You have to remember, the United States was fiercely isolationist at this point.
And strictly neutral. Strictly neutral. The organizers hoped that by feeding these highly romanticized stories of brave American boys flying in combat to the neutral U.S. press, they could basically create the first modern media celebrities of the war.
They wanted to sway isolationist voters.
Yeah, persuade the U.S. to abandon neutrality and drag a superpower into a global conflict.
Wait, so two random civilians thought they could single-handedly force the President of the United States out of neutrality just by starting a flying club.
Well, it sounds absurd when you put it that way, but the French Air Department actually saw the potential in the PR campaign. They knew how powerful American newspapers were.
That is a massive diplomatic gamble.
It was.
Yeah.
But it worked. The unit was officially authorized on March 21, 1916, and by April 20th of that same year, they were officially deployed in Luxeuil-les-Bains.
That's a town in France right near the Swiss border, right?
Yes, exactly. And initially, there were just 7 American pilots kicking things off. This included Norman Prince himself, along with guys like Victor Chapman, Kiffin Rockwell, and William Thaw II. Wow, just 7 guys to start.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the immediate diplomatic tension this caused on the world stage. The unit was originally called the Escadrille Américaine.
Which is pretty on the nose.
Right. And Germany paid very close attention to this. They actually filed a formal diplomatic objection with the U.S. government. And legally speaking, Germany had a totally valid point.
Because they were supposed to be neutral.
Exactly. Germany complained that a supposedly neutral nation had a named active military unit fighting against them on the front lines. The original name practically implied that the United States was already allied with France.
Yeah, I can totally see how having the word American painted on planes, dropping bombs on your troops, would make you question a country's neutrality. A pivot was completely necessary to avoid a massive international incident.
And the French were quick. By December 1916, they cleverly changed the name to the Lafayette Escadrille.
Which is such a brilliant move. It honored the Marquis de Lafayette, the famous French hero who came over to help the Americans during the Revolutionary War.
It was a very subtle nod to a shared history without officially stamping the word America on the side of the planes.
Right. It was a very elegant loophole to a thorny diplomatic problem. It allowed the unit to continue operating and growing under the banner of a shared Franco-American heritage.
Keeping the PR engine running perfectly without technically violating international neutrality laws.
By the way, for those wondering, escadrille is simply the French military term for a squadron. Looking at the actual makeup of this particular squadron, while it was famous for being American, It was heavily French in its foundation.
Oh, absolutely.
There were exactly 5 French officers assigned to the group, and that included their commander, Captain Georges Thénault. On the American side, the full roster eventually included exactly 38 American pilots.
Who would later become known in history as the Valiant 38.
The Valiant 38. And everything about their operation was French. They flew French aircraft, they relied on French mechanics, and they wore French uniforms.
The Americans essentially provided the manpower and the highly marketable faces for the newspapers, but the infrastructure was entirely supplied by the French military. It was a true joint operation in practice.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you'd think a military airfield near the front lines of a global war would be strictly business.
Yeah.
But this squadron had 2 unofficial members that you absolutely wouldn't expect to find.
Oh, the lions.
Yes. They kept 2 live lion cubs roaming around the base. They named them Whiskey and Soda.
Which is just incredible.
Right. They functioned as mascots purely to provide the pilots with a little bit of psychological relief from the extreme stress of battle.
And we really need to pause and emphasize why that stress was so unbelievably extreme. The aircraft of that era, planes like the Newport 11, the Newport 17, and later the SAP days, they were not just flimsy.
Flimsy is an understatement.
To give you an idea, the Newport 11 was essentially a wooden frame wrapped in doped linen. It didn't even have a throttle as we know it today.
No throttle.
No. The engine was a rotary engine, meaning the entire engine block spun with the propeller. And as it spun, it spewed unburned castor oil right into the pilot's face.
Oh, that's awful.
And because there was no throttle, the engine was either fully on or completely off. So pilots had to constantly kill their own engines midair just to slow down or maneuver.
Wait, they turned off the engine while flying?
Yes. They'd hit a blip switch, cut the ignition, make their turn, and then pray the engine would catch again when they turned it back on.
That is terrifying. You are thousands of feet in the air in a linen box, deliberately turning off your own engine during a dogfight.
Exactly. And if the engine didn't fail, vital structural parts would often just snap during tight maneuvers. On top of that, their machine guns, usually Vickers or Lewis guns, constantly jammed right at the exact moment they were needed most in combat.
Because the technology was so new.
Right. The synchronization gear, which was supposed to let the machine gun fire safely through the spinning propeller blades, was notoriously unreliable early on. Pilots sometimes shot their own propellers to pieces.
That paints an entirely different picture than the glamorous Knights of the Sky narrative the PR campaign was selling to the folks back home.
There is a massive disconnect between the shiny headlines in America and the horrific reality these pilots were waking up to every day in France. There's this one story from the records that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
One of the American men in the unit actually begged to be transferred out of the glamorous flying squadron and sent back to his infantry unit in the muddy trenches, just so, in his own words, he could be safe.
The trenches of World War I are universally recognized as some of the most horrific combat environments in human history. To think someone would rather face mustard gas and artillery shells than get back into an airplane is deeply unsettling.
I want to address you directly on this point. Imagine the sheer terror of early flight, where the mud, the disease, and the artillery fire of the Western Front actually looked like a safer option to you than climbing into a cockpit. What stands out to you about that level of risk?
It's just hard to wrap your head around.
The psychological fortitude required just to start the engine, let alone fly into combat against an enemy, is staggering.
And that fortitude was put to the test immediately. The unit racked up incredible firsts, but they also suffered heavy, tragic tolls. If we look at their combat timeline, they saw their first major action on May 13, 1916, at the Battle of Verdun.
One of the worst battles of the war.
Right. And just 5 days later, on May 18th, a pilot named Kiffin Rockwell recorded the unit's very first aerial victory. But the reality of this war caught up incredibly fast. By September of that same year, Rockwell was killed when his plane was downed by a gunner in a German Albatross observation plane.
And Rockwell wasn't the first fatality, unfortunately. That heartbreaking milestone went to Victor Chapman. He was shot down over Douaumont a few months earlier on June 23, 1916.
Even the unit's founder, Norman Prince, the man who helped engineer this entire media campaign, he didn't survive to see the end of the war.
No, he didn't.
In October 1916, he was fatally injured after crashing his plane on a final approach to his own airfield. It wasn't even a dogfight that took him. It was just the sheer, everyday danger of flying these early machines.
But amidst all this tragedy, there were some incredible feats of skill. Take Raoul Lufbery, for instance. He was a French-born American citizen who joined the squadron and ultimately became their first and highest-scoring flying ace.
And for those who might not know, an ace is a military designation for a pilot who has shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft.
Right, and Lufbery racked up 16 confirmed victories. Because of the constant machine gun jams we talked about earlier, Lufbery was famous for personally inspecting and polishing every single bullet before it went into his gun's drum.
Every single one. That shows you the level of detail required just to survive.
Exactly. He developed specific, meticulous tactics that made him a master of a very deadly, very new art form.
Then there's the story of Edmund Genet. His story represents exactly what the founders had been hoping for diplomatically, but it came with a tragic personal end. When the United States finally entered the war against Germany, the geopolitical goal of the unit was essentially achieved.
They got what they wanted.
They did. But Genet had already been active in the escadrille long before the U.S. declared war. Because he died in combat just a few days after the U.S. official entry into the conflict, Edmund Genet became the first official U.S. casualty of World War I.
And his death made massive headlines back home, cementing the emotional connection the American public had with the war effort.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the statistics really outline a brutal reality of what this group and the broader network of American volunteers went through.
Yeah, looking at the total registry of Americans who volunteered in French aviation at the time, 51 died in combat. Another 11 died of other causes, mostly accidents. 15 of these men became prisoners of war.
Those are heavy numbers for such a small community.
They really are. But amidst all that loss, 11 of those pilots achieved that coveted status of ace. It was a high-risk, high-reward environment where survival was genuinely a daily roll of the dice.
As the war progressed and America fully mobilized, the structure of the unit had to change. On February 18, 1918, the escadrille was officially disbanded.
But the American personnel didn't just pack up and go home.
No, they were transferred into the United States Army Air Service, which had finally arrived in Europe under the new designation of the 103rd Aero Squadron. And for a brief period, they even kept their French planes and mechanics.
Their veteran experience was absolutely invaluable to the U.S. military at that point. Most of these battle-hardened survivors were immediately put to work training the fresh, newly arrived American pilots who had never seen aerial combat.
Which makes perfect sense.
But the 103rd still fought, and they were credited with a further 45 kills before the armistice finally went into effect on November 11, 1918. Meanwhile, the French personnel formed their own unit, carrying on the traditions of the original group within the French military.
So, the war ends, the unit is cemented in history, and then things get incredibly muddy. This is where the Hollywood confusion starts.
Oh, the myth-making.
After the Great War, over 4,000 people suddenly started claiming they were members of the legendary Lafayette Escadrille. We aren't just talking about regular veterans exaggerating their service in local bars. This included a dozen well-known Hollywood personalities and even several high-ranking government officials claiming they flew with the unit.
It's a massive historical mix-up, and honestly, it really speaks to how incredibly potent the original public relations campaign was that Gross and Prince designed. The brand of the Lafayette Escadrille was so glamorous, so universally revered in the press that everyone wanted to associate themselves with it.
But the math just doesn't lie.
No, it doesn't. The actual Lafayette Escadrille, that specific frontline unit, consisted of exactly 5 French officers and 38 American pilots. That's it, just the Valiant 38.
How does a myth grow so large that thousands of people successfully claim to be part of a 38-man unit? Well, from the very beginning, there was a huge public blurring in the press between the official Lafayette Escadrille, which was a designated specific squadron, and something completely different called the Lafayette Flying Corps.
Right. The Lafayette Flying Corps wasn't a military unit at all. It was essentially an unofficial paper organization. It was an umbrella term used in a published roster to highlight all the American volunteer aviators, about 231 of them in total, who flew across more than 90 different French operational squadrons.
So they were real pilots.
Yes, they were brave men doing incredible things, absolutely, but they were spread out all over the French military. They were not flying with the specific Lafayette Escadrille unit.
But the general public, and certainly the newspapers, didn't care about military semantics. They just blurred it all together. Over the decades, films only made the confusion worse.
Hollywood rarely lets facts get in the way of a good story.
Exactly. Movies like The Legion of the Condemned in 1928 or Lafayette Escadrille, starring Tab Hunter in 1958, heavily romanticized the history. And definitely the 2006 film Flyboys, directed by Tony Bill. Flyboys in particular heavily exacerbated the already existing confusion about who was actually in the unit, how many of them there were, and what they actually did.
Pop culture just grabbed the myth and ran away with it, prioritizing a cinematic spectacle over the factual roster.
Which is somewhat inevitable when a true story is this naturally dramatic. But even if you strip away all the Hollywood embellishments and the thousands of fake veterans, the factual legacy and the genuine tributes to this unit are profound.
The cultural impact lasted for decades after the armistice.
The name carried so much cultural weight that in 1932, just a couple of days after she became the first female aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic, Amelia Earhart was actually made an honorary member of the Escadrille Lafayette.
That's a huge honor.
It is. And the unit's lineage didn't just stay in the history books. It continued right into World War II. The Lafayette Escadrille became the third flight unit of a French fighter group. By late 1942 and early 1943, they were flying American-made Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts alongside the Allies.
But perhaps the most moving tribute is the physical one. Just outside of Paris, in Marne-la-Coquette, sits the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Cemetery. It was the final work of French architect Alexandre Marcel, completed and dedicated in 1928.
It's supposed to be stunning.
It is a majestic, sweeping monument designed to serve as a permanent physical reminder of what happens when two nations bleed for the same cause.
Just picturing it based on the architectural descriptions in the source text is striking. It features a massive, ornate central arch that is actually half the size of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
It's massive.
There's a beautiful reflecting pool running the length of the structure and stunning stained glass windows in the crypt below that vividly depict the major battles of the Western Front.
And that crypt is the truly sacred part of the memorial. It contains 68 sarcophagi, one for each of the aviators of the broader Lafayette Flying Corps who lost their lives during the war.
Wow.
Today, 49 of those aviators are entombed right there in that crypt, resting alongside two of their French commanding officers. In 2017, the American Battle Monuments Commission actually assumed ownership and responsibility for the site to ensure it is preserved and maintained forever.
So what does this all mean? When we look back at the Lafayette Escadrille, we aren't just looking at a list of aerial dogfights or early wooden plane models. We are looking at a masterclass in political maneuvering executed by civilians who understood the power of the press.
And we are looking at the raw, almost incomprehensible bravery of men who climbed into fabric boxes knowing their engines might fail, their guns might jam, and they might have to shoot their own propellers just to survive.
We are looking at how the intense danger they faced succeeded in its ultimate goal, capturing the imagination of a neutral nation and helping it alter the course of a world war.
This raises an important question, one that pushes past the history books and right into our modern world. Think about what Dr. Edmund Gross and Norman Prince actually accomplished here. They bypassed their own government's stated foreign policy to force a global shift.
A completely grassroots diplomatic push.
Yes. So ponder this. Can the actions of a few rogue volunteers fighting under a foreign flag ever truly force the hand of a neutral superpower today? In an age of immediate global communication, if a handful of citizens can shift public opinion enough to drag a nation into a conflict, who really holds the ultimate power of diplomacy? Is it the government signing treaties behind closed doors, or is it the people willing to put their lives on the line for a headline?
That is exactly the kind of question that makes digging into these sources so rewarding. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration of the Lafayette Escadrille has given you a shortcut to being well-informed on a truly incredible piece of history. Until next time, keep questioning the history you thought you knew and keep diving deep.